Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cynthia, for inviting me. So my charge was to talk about background checks. I took that charge and sort of extended a little bit to a general idea of how do we keep guns from people who are too dangerous to have them? So I want to start from right there, okay? So for much of our country's history, in many states anyway, there really was no vetting system for being able to purchase lethal weapons, firearms. It was only in 1968 where we created sort of the most basic system of keeping records. And if you were going to purchase a firearm, you had to sign this little federal form to say that you weren't in one of these prohibited categories. And so these prohibited categories are very familiar probably to everybody in this room. You've been convicted of a felony crime. You've been convicted of a domestic battery, misdemeanor crime. April already covered very well the domestic violence protective order prohibitions. So it was only in 1968 where you just even had a system that I think of sort of as an honor system, like, yeah, promise you're not in one of these categories. So it wasn't until the Brady Act came into being that we required this background check that, again, my comments are going to focus on. But of course, and I think, again, in this audience, probably everyone knows, that system was a huge improvement from what we had from the 68 Gun Control Act, but with huge gaps, okay? And the most obvious gap is the universal dimension that Chris referred to, meaning that the federal laws only apply to licensed firearm dealers, so transactions involving from those licensed dealers. And so I was also instructed, I take everything from Cynthia Lum very seriously, that I wasn't going to do too many slides. So minimum number of slides. I also discovered that I actually have a duplicate in there, so I'll rush through there. But I'm going to actually connect somewhat to Dr. Wintemute's study, which is not a surprise to me because our research interests intertwine so much, and so much, frankly, about what we know about background checks and this general idea of how in the heck do you keep guns from people who are too dangerous to have them. We can thank Gary and Wintemute for helping lead that and for the amazing data that they've been able to generate in California. So let's just start at the most basic level, okay? Does denying, someone could go in and who is in a prohibited category, go to a licensed dealer and say, I want this gun or that gun, and they could be denied. But of course, as well known, Garen referred it to as a secondary market, there are options. So this basic question, does being denied through this background check system, does it matter? Okay, so Mona Wright and Garen and colleagues found out, indeed, felons that were denied purchase through this background check process were less likely to commit gun violence as a result. But we know that, again, there are many weaknesses in background check laws that have been really exploited by traffickers, straw purchasers, and by criminals. I'm going to talk about that moving forward. I'm also intersecting with Dr. Winmute when it comes to what we colloquially will refer to as ghost guns, untraceable, privately made firearms, the vast majority of which come from do-it-yourself kits. Marketed, the most common maker of these has been Polymer 80. And the only thing I'll sort of correct from Garen's talk is that this reduction is not limited to California. So Maryland and California both have, in US terms, fairly strict laws designed to keep guns from people who shouldn't have them. We have some great data from Baltimore that I've been using and will be doing more from. But this slide, I think, is just very dramatic. You don't have to do any fancy regression analysis to see that the trajectory that we were on with more and more of these guns being used in violent crime in Baltimore City was interrupted. It was interrupted precisely at the point in which both federal and state laws kicked in to say you have to treat these do-it-yourself kits as any other firearm, which means, of course, you have to go through the background check system in order to get them. And I will also just say that, again, looking at Baltimore's data, this is very much, these kits were very much marketed to underage youth and felons and other prohibited people. So again, it gets to this general idea of we need a system to keep guns from prohibited people. The do-it-yourself kits went around that. We had a regulatory process that interrupted it, which is a broader lesson to learn that, wow, it's really hard to address with these different holes in our laws, but we do find some successes. There have been a number of studies, I've done some of them, but economists and others have been doing them as well. And it's apparent, even in a more casual examination of the data, that interstate gun trafficking patterns are driven largely by this relative strength of the overall background systems in place in each of those states. Okay, so Chicago's guns, for example, a lot of them come from Indiana that has very weak laws, Illinois relatively strict laws. What we found in our analysis, and other studies has found them as well, is that when you do the more sophisticated analysis, you find that having comprehensive background checks is critical in deterring interstate trafficking, as is purchaser licensing law, something I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But very importantly, the strength of state gun dealer regulations and actually enforcement. Okay, this gets back again to Dr. Wintemuth's think about his study about these problematic dealers, these outliers that are creating channeling a lot of guns into crime. When you have state processes to sort of rein those actors in, you have fewer guns that are diverted and used for violent crime. This is just sort of another picture. This sort of shows this more graphically of how guns move and the interstate traffic guns leading the pack. Here is guns coming from Georgia, Texas, and Arizona. Virginia, a lot of their guns come into Washington, D.C., and in Maryland, both jurisdictions having relatively strict gun laws. But again, the patterns are quite familiar and very consistent with this general idea of the strength of the whole process, or the vetting process for selling firearms. Now, Garen again noted one thing I'm just holding up here from the recent analysis of ATF gun trafficking investigations, that the two most common channels, if you will, in these investigations were people who were unlicensed sellers who were actually in the business of firearms. I want to underscore something very important in recent policy. In 2022 Comprehensive Safety Act sort of strengthened how we define what it means to be in the business. So what that law did is said, if you're selling guns for a profit, then you must keep records, do background checks, and so on. I'm very curious with Garen's study showing a noteworthy reduction in these short time to crime guns. Guns moving very quickly from retail to involvement in crime is going down. These unlicensed sellers are part of this issue, and perhaps this is a relative success that we should examine more. I'm actually going to skip this because that's my duplicate slide. Here's my more pretty slide. So what have we learned when you basically you require background checks for private sales? We haven't seen population level significant reductions in fatal crime. There's a number of reasons for that, some having to do with a lot of people who commit gun crime aren't prohibited. There's incomplete records. But most importantly, I want to underscore that the retailers are the entry point for this whole process. We're putting a lot on them to again, look at Garen's slide about this straw purchase. This is very obvious. That retailer could have said, no, I'm not going to do this. Imagine if they had to go through a licensing process through law enforcement. So what we've learned is that in a number of studies, that when you add a licensing requirement, purchaser licensing requirement, that this leads to significant reductions in basically all forms of gun violence that we looked at. We see less gun trafficking, we see reductions in gun homicides, gun suicides, fewer hospitalizations for firearm injuries, and fewer shootings involving law enforcement, both as victims shot in the line of duty, as well as them shooting civilians. And this is a policy that is widely supported. I'll end there.